So now in the grocery list Dart file, we can finally start fetching our data from Firebase. And here I want to fetch my data in add item after we came back from the new item screen. Hence I will keep a wait here to wait for this future to resolve, so to wait for the user to come back. But we won't get the new item anymore because in new item.dart I'm not passing any data to pop. Hence we shouldn't wait for this here. We don't need this check anymore, and we don't need this code because I am not getting any new items here. Instead, I just wait for the user to come back to then fetch my data from the backend again. Now to do this, we need to send such a GET request here to Firebase. And this is again done by using this HTTP package, which I'll therefore import into grocerylist.dart as I imported it into new item.dart. And then here in add item, after we came back from the navigation, we can and should create a new URL in the same way as before. So here in new item.dart, I want to grab this URL construction logic here, like this. And with that, we can send such a GET request by using this HTTP package, and then there, instead of the post, the GET method. This then wants such a URL, and that's basically it. We could also add such a headers map here for extra metadata that should be added to the request, but here this will actually not be needed. But we, for example, can't add a body because a GET request is always about getting data, not sending data. Hence, you don't add a body to it. So therefore, that's all we have to do. And now, of course, we should await this to get hold of the response, because it will be that response that contains the data. At the moment, we just send the request, but of course that's worthless if we don't use the data that's returned. Now to see which data is returned, I'll simply print response here. If I now save that and reload, this app reloads. And if we now take a look at the debug console here, we see nothing. So looks like no HTTP request was sent. And indeed, that's the case, because I'm only sending one here after adding a new item. But actually, I also want to send such a request if the app loads up and I reach this screen for the first time. Therefore, I'll actually add a new method here. Load items could be the name. Of course, it's up to you. And the return value is void, not final. And it's now in there where I want to send my request and print the response. And this should therefore also be an async method by adding the async keyword here. It's now load items, which I want to execute here in add item like this. And we can await it, but I'm not returning any data here, and I don't want to do anything thereafter, so we don't have to. And it's now also load items, which I want to execute if this widget loads up for the first time, so if the app just got started. And how can we execute code if this was rendered for the first time, if this widget was just created? Well, since we're in a state class here, we want to add the initState method. Because you learned before, this is a method that allows you to do some initialization work. And the initialization work I want to do here is that I send my request. So here we can call load items like this. And this should therefore make sure that this method here, is triggered and this request is sent if this state object is created for the first time, which is the case if the app just started or restarted. Hence, with this added here, if we restart the app again, nothing happens here, of course, because we're not updating the UI in any way. But if I open my debug console, I do now see this part here. We got back an object which was of type response. And if we dive into this object by printing response.body instead, we should see even more. If I now reload, you see I'm getting back this data here. And that in the end is JSON data, where I have keys that are the unique IDs that were generated by Firebase. And then as values, I have nested maps, so nested objects, you could say, with the data that's stored under these IDs on Firebase. So that's the data we're getting back from Firebase, and that's of course the data we can now use to update the UI. For that, here in load items, we want to convert this JSON data back to regular Dart objects, to Dart maps with which we can work, by using this JSON utility object again, which is imported from Dart convert, as you learned. And this now has a decode method. Before we used encode to convert a map to JSON. Now we use decode to convert this JSON text format back to a map. And here I want to decode response.body. This then yields us a dynamic value because of course Dart doesn't know how this response body is formatted, but we know that in the end it will be our list data. And of course this variable name is up to you. Now this list data will have this format here, just converted to a map, but the same keys and the same nested maps. Of course, I now want to convert this back to a list of grocery items. And to do this, we could add a for loop here, where we loop through our list data entries. And we know that list data will be a map, so we can also tell Dart that this will be a map, and that it will actually be a map where we have string keys and then map values, because we'll have these keys here and then maps as values for these keys. And these inner maps will also have string keys, but they will have dynamic values. We have 2 strings and 1 integer. So here we actually have dynamic values in those nested maps. But with that, Dart knows that list data will be a map, and we loop through all the map entries now, so all the outer key value pairs with those unique IDs as keys and the nested maps as values. And inside of that loop, we can now convert these nested maps to grocery items, and we can add them to a new temporarily created loaded items list, which should be a list of grocery items. This does not change. I'm creating a temporary list here because I then want to replace this list here, which we use in the overall class, with this list after I parsed all the loaded items here. So in this loop, where we now go through all the items, we want to add new items to this temporary local list here by calling add. And we want to create a new grocery item here by using our own grocery item class and its constructor function here. And to grocery item, we now have to pass the ID, which actually should be item.key. So these auto-generated IDs provided by Firebase, I want to use those as IDs because these are perfect IDs. And then for the name, for example, I want to use item.value to dive into this nested map here, and then there it's the name. So item.value and then with square brackets, the name. This is how we access this key with a name of name inside of this nested map. And now we can do the same for the quantity. This would be item.value quantity like this. And for the category, we don't want to use item.value category because the category here is just the title. Because that's what we sent with the post request before, just the title. I now want to get a full category object again. And of course here I actually want to get a category that's stored in my categories list. So this list of predefined categories. But of course, thankfully there, we can simply search for a category with a certain title. Now to get this category from this categories list here, we can search for it before we start adding a new grocery item to our loaded items here by creating a new temporary local category final variable. And then here I want to reach out to my categories map and there to all the entries, which as you learned is a list of items where every item has a key property and a value property. And now since this is a list here, we can search for the first item that matches a certain condition, which can be done with first where. And this is of course not something you have to do every time you're loading data with the HTTP request. Instead, that's specific to this app here, where I sent only my category title to Firebase, and I now want to match it to some local in-memory data again. First where is almost like where, which we used earlier in the course to filter a list. First where will now also filter a list, but it will only yield one item, the first matching item where a certain condition is met. So here we got our category item or cat item, which is such an item with a key and a value property. And now I want to find the item where my cat item value dot title, because this will now be one of the categories in my list of categories here, or in my map of categories to be precise. So where I have one of those categories where the title is equal to item dot value category. That's the category in the end I want to add down there. Now again, to make this clear what we're doing here, we're going through all the entries in this categories map here, where our keys are enum values and the values are category objects. And we're taking a look at all these items, and for every item I check if the value, so this category object, has a title that's equal to the value stored under the category key on that item that's part of our response. Because this list data here, that's our response data. So item refers to the response data, cat item refers to the categories in this predefined categories map here. With that, I get back my category here, or to be precise, such a map entry, where I then can chain dot value at the end here, and this will now finally give me the category that was identified. With that, we got the category, which we can set as a value here when creating that grocery item. And this now creates a new grocery item, adds it to this temporary loaded items list, and does that for all the items that are part of the response. So that for every response item, we create a new grocery item with the category from that list of predefined categories and the data that's fetched from the backend, including this auto-generated unique ID, which is provided by Firebase. Well, and now after going through all of that, I want to use my loaded items to override my locally available grocery items. So this grocery items property of the grocery list state class. Now to override it, I'll convert this from final to var, or since I have a type annotation here, get rid of that keyword. Because now I want to reassign grocery items, and I want to reassign it here. After this for loop, so after we close this for loop, I want to set grocery items equal to loaded items to overwrite that list. And this should be done inside of set state here actually, to make sure that the build method executes again and the UI is updated. With that, if we save this, nothing happens here. So let's go back and open the debug console. And there we learn that the problem seems to be that the type map string dynamic is not a subtype of map string dynamic. So my type definition here is a bit too specific for Dart. We should simply replace it with map dynamic to make sure that Dart's happy with it. Now you may also see a slightly different error message where you see that type null is not a subtype of type map something, and you'll get this error message if you actually have no items on your backend, because you haven't followed along with the previous lectures or because you deleted all the items that have been added to Firebase. To get around this error, you should simply add some items to Firebase, and as soon as you do that, the error will go away. And we'll handle the case that we have no items on the backend a little bit later in this section. With this adjustment made though, now this loads, and now we can see the data here. Deleting won't work, but we can see it here. And if I now add a new item, like milk, we go back after adding it and we see that data here as well. Also, of course, if I reload, because then it also loads again. And that's how we can load data from the backend. But that's not all I want to do related to that.